From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's today's lineup. K-State's Dan O'Brien will comment on the news that the U.S. and China are on the verge of an agricultural trade agreement. And he'll discuss the USDA's latest projections on grain prices during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Also today, K-State's Terry Griffin talks about a different kind of analysis that he's just finished up. He tallied articles from a highly respected journal to identify trends in farm management research, which indicated to him where such research might best be directed going forward. And K-State's Mary Knapp is standing by to visit about Kansas agricultural weather. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, and as always, thanks for tuning in. We are at no loss for things to talk over as we get into the grain market scene this week. Dan O'Brien along with us once more. Grain market economist for K-State Research and Extension. Dan is stationed in Northwest Kansas, joins us every Friday here. We can't help but start with what we know to the moment anyway, Dan, on the tentative Phase 1 trade deal with China. Now, until the ink is dry on that agreement, nothing is for certain here, but this has caused, obviously, a buzz in the market.
Well, yes, and when you add on top of that some positive actual export news that was happening in, corn, soybeans, and wheat prior to this, then with this, it'll be really interesting to see by the end of the day today how the markets end up and respond to this. We understand so far that deal has been reached in principle between the U.S. and China on Phase 1. And again, Phase 1 is primarily agriculture and other key trade issues. So that's positive, and we received news that the administration has signed off on it. So I think we just need to see the details before we get euphoric about what might happen. And again, the bigger issue, i.e. the proof in the pudding, will be actual purchases, trade moving forward positively. I do think that a note of caution on this is that, because of the way these negotiations have worked out, you've given an incentive to China to make sure that they diversify their suppliers, to not just rely on one country specifically. So to the degree that we see development happening in the Brazilian Amazon and in other places, that would be an effort on the part of the Chinese, again, to manage their risk of supply. Now, that said, I think that can probably be overcome with a good, sound relationship going forward, and again, open trade. And from an economist's point of view, we certainly acknowledge that open trade, free trade, is better for the economies of all these countries because, again, if you're involved in free trade, you're buying the most economical product that you can get. Your businesses, your consumers are all better off, et cetera. So from an economist's point of view, you try to look objectively at the development like this, and on the one hand, it's very, very positive. On the other, we'll just have to see how these different players act and behave towards each other and in the world markets as they go forward.
But if there is follow-through, this comes to fruition, there is a huge value in certainty of the trade relationship between the two countries. We've been talking about uncertainty for months upon months now.
And we probably look to soybeans first.
Right.
And we haven't been having too bad sales in soybeans. And of course, just on Friday, a week ago, that they were taking steps to open up trade, drop tariffs and any limitations on both beef and soybeans. And now with this following, then that's all for the positive. And from there, let the price competition begin. It'll be a matter of U.S. versus Brazilian supplies, and Argentina also in play in that, and we'll just have to see where the economic forces drive things. But without the tariffs in place, there seems to be a lot better chance for the U.S. ag products to compete all that much more readily, and it should be a helper for us in terms of U.S. grain markets and the U.S. farm economy going forward.
And while we're discussing trade, let's throw in a word here, too, about the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, apparently on its way to ratification. Dan.
Yes, also it heard news that certain elements having to do with labor restrictions that were of concern to different parties here in the U.S. were addressed, and generally there seems to be a round of consensus and positiveness towards approval in that through the U.S. government. So positive news for sure, and again, how important North American trade is, free flow of that, and particularly for agriculture, that the U.S. can trade freely with Mexico. Just such an important destination for U.S. products that news of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal seemingly coming to final approval is certainly good for ag markets.
All right. Well, the USDA did provide its latest world agricultural supply and demand estimates this past Tuesday, including grain stocks and grain production. But if you look at this report in total, it was rather nondescript in respect to how it impacted the market.
For corn, soybeans, and I think for grain sorghum as well, really no changes at all in the balance sheet. And my own thought towards that and seeing that was that we really anticipate there'll probably be close scrutiny and likely some, at least, production changes, supply changes that'll come out in the January 10th report. So as long as there was nothing egregiously out of line, it seemed that it's just as well out of line in terms of supply-demand trends. As we said here in December, it seemed that the USDA just decided to leave things as they were. Now, the wheat supply-demand balance sheet did show mostly positive news and one kind of cautionary note. On the positive side, in acknowledgement of a pretty good, quote, decent rate of U.S. wheat exports and issues elsewhere, again, ongoing challenges in Australia, you name it, that the USDA did raise the hard red winter wheat export number, 10 million bushels from 380 million up to 390 for this marketing year, and the overall U.S. Export set of numbers up 25 million up to 975. With that, you drop the U.S. wheat ending stocks figure down below 1 billion bushels down to, I think it's 974 million, so over a billion bushel drop in U.S. ending stocks. Stocks to use down to 46%, down from 53 a year before. With all that, those are positive changes in the market. There was a decline of about 5 cents in the projected price for U.S. wheat for this marketing year. So I think that's probably an acknowledgement that we've had some pretty low prices to this point in time so far, and just the lower prices we'd seen earlier are weighing on that marketing year average.
And what did the report have to share as far as the latest price projections for corn and soybeans then? Well,
for corn, left unchanged at $3.85 a bushel for the marketing year. For soybeans, price projection was lowered 15 cents down to $8.85. So now it'll be really interesting to see as we head off into January, and if we have some requisite response in U.S. soybean exports as thought might happen, that be interesting to see now with the remainder of the marketing year in front of us where the projected prices will go. Very likely we could head back to where we were in previous reports at least to $9, and we'll see where it goes from there.
But again, that report caused very few ripples in the markets, so it would infer that the trades are going to be much more interested, as you've been suggesting for some time, in that January WASDE report.
Yeah, and the January WASDE report is kind of the final index of a whole number of other reports that will be coming out the same day that the USDA will need to bring together. Of course, there'll be the final U.S. crop production report, and we say final in quotes because a fair amount of the crop, U.S. corn crop, is still out in the field. So we look at the percent harvested versus the projection of yield in these various states, particularly to the north. 1 billion, 1.25 billion or more bushels of corn are still out in the field unharvested. And being from an old farm setting, corn setting in the long run in tough weather, you're bound to have some harvest losses, that they'll be dealing with. So there'll be a grain stocks number, and will that stocks number include grain that's only been harvested or anticipated to be harvested? It's like almost secured supplies versus, quote, in the field or on the stock. So that'll be a real source of uncertainty. So whatever number they come up with for U.S. corn production for 2019 will go into the supply-demand balance sheet. And if there's a question mark beside that, we won't have answered the question yet in terms of where our final production and ending stocks are. When, in fact, as that thing works its way through and heading off the rest of winter and into spring, also you'll have issues about the availability of corn and its impact on grain usage. If I can add in on this, I was at a meeting in South Dakota earlier this week, and of course, unharvested grains front and center in their thoughts. And what I kept hearing from talking to ag producers up there had a lot to do with lower test weight corn. That because of the way the season worked out, apparently they didn't see quite the end of the year finishing off of those crops as they'd hoped for, and the price we see quoted up in those areas may not be the price that farmers are actually getting by the time discounts for lower quality, lower test weight, and whatever are taken into account. So it's not just bushels that's at stake in those northern states. It's the quality of what they're able to get out of the field. So a real challenging situation for those folks. You really feel for those farmers in that area that are struggling with this situation and see their income source still out there waiting to be harvested.
Yeah. Well, that said, there's been a flurry of factors here toward the end of the trading week to consider, so it's going to be quite a scene to watch here in the coming days in the grain trades for sure. And we'd remind folks, as always, to take advantage of the notes that Dan posts each week on the markets on agmanager.info. Dan, have a good weekend, and many thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today returns after this over the K-State Radio Network.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Agriculture Today continues. There's an interesting new report out of the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State, and in broad terms, it's looking at trends in farm management research on the part of land-grant universities, including K-State, and where there may be needs for accelerated research. To explain here, one of the co-authors of this new work, Terry Griffin, as you know, is a precision agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension. This is something out of the norm as far as agricultural economics research goes, Terry. So explain the initiative that you've put together here with your co-author.
Well, this is sort of research on research. So there's a journal that's been in press for several decades called the Journal of the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers, so ASFMRA. The professional farm managers are the driving force of this, as well as professional rural appraisers. You know, there's several in Kansas in private practice representing landowners with farmers, as well as a lot of lending institutions. Ag lenders will have rural appraisers to appraise farmland. Well, they have their own journal, and it goes back close to 100 years. I had access to the last 20 years electronically. And I thought it'd be really neat to see what topics were evaluated over the last 2 decades, and there was 330 articles over that time period. And so what we did, we took the titles and we did a keyword analysis, and we also assigned each article to one of 11 core farm management topics, and to see how often those topics were represented over time, and to see if there was a trend. If let's say some of these topics were more common the early 2000s versus the most previous 5 years. So it was an effort to do research on farm management research itself.
And the ultimate objective here was to understand what farm management topics tend to get the larger share of research attention as opposed to others that might be somewhat overlooked but nonetheless might deserve more attention?
Exactly. If we could find a void in some of those 11 core areas, then that would tell us areas that potentially need more research, or we need to rethink those categories if they are truly important to farm management.
So what were those 11 core areas you described?
The 11 general farm management topics, we had crops, finance, human issues, farmland, livestock, machinery, marketing, planning, policy, risk, and technology. And as you can imagine, some were more represented than others.
Well, let's get right to that because you ran this count, if you will, of articles that fit each of those 11 categories. And you got an idea of which are most prominent in this journal over time and which have been hardly tended to. So which topics tend to draw the most research, attention, and effort?
So the most, over the last 20 years, the most common topic, 65 of the 330 articles, was on crops, followed by farmland. Farmland has been an important part, and that includes farmland values, rental agreement, flexible cash rents, and that kind of thing. And livestock, farmland and livestock were almost equally represented at about 54 articles out of 330 over the last 20 years. But crops was number one at 65 articles.
And that should come as no terrible surprise.
No, and crops is pretty broad. Basically, any plant I considered a crop. It doesn't have to be corn, soybean, grain, sorghum. I also lumped in horticultural crops and that kind of thing. And same for livestock. If it was catfish or bison or raising wildlife, I included it under the livestock umbrella.
Take it to the other end of this spectrum, then. Which topics tended to draw the least attention in those journal articles?
Well, the very least was planning at 4 of the 330 articles. So ag planning, which we spend a lot of time talking about in farm management, right? So, we have the ag mediation service here at K-State that has a lot to do with planning. We talk about whole farm planning, financial planning a lot. But in these articles, it was rarely showing up at all.
There's just little research analysis in those fields then.
Well, I asked that question, and part of it is there are certain authors and certain universities that contribute to this journal. Mm-hmm. And that might be a function of the author's interest, their expertise areas. But that does raise a question that I would like to dive deeper into. But this may be surprising that the second least represented category was machinery. Something that
this is right in your wheelhouse.
It is. But there's also a technology category as well. So we had to separate the ag tech from machinery. But machinery is only 7 of the 330 articles in 20 years.
And frankly, technology isn't that high up on the ladder either, according to your analysis.
No, there's only 15 of the 330 that dealt with technology. And technology, keep in mind, too, that 20 years ago, technology was different then than it is today, right? So, what we considered high-tech precision ag in the year 2000 would maybe not be considered high-tech in 2019.
So when you look at these numbers and you think about what they're saying, what are they suggesting about the future direction of farm management research?
Well, I'm not going to get into what should occur, but given a long enough time period, 20 years plus, we would expect more of an uniform, more of an equal representation across all categories if those categories were truly important farm management topics for farm management researchers. But let's take that a step further and discuss who are the contributors to this journal, and in particular, what universities are represented.
Largely land-grant universities, presumably.
Largely land-grant universities, USDA, We do have some private sector, and I lumped anyone that was working for a professional farm management service, a rural appraiser, ag lender, commodity commissions, and those sorts were all lumped together as private sector. The number one institution as far as number of articles or authors was Kansas State University over the last 20 years. But Kansas State was not the only university. Other ones that were highly represented were Purdue, University in Indiana, University of Illinois, pretty high on the list. At K-State, a large percent of our faculty have been authors to this journal, so it wasn't just one or two of us.
One has to think that the presence of the Kansas Farm Management Association and its personnel factored in there somewhere.
It does. I did not document that in this article, but I can tell you that both Purdue and Kansas State University have published from the KFMA data set in this particular journal in the past. It is a recurring theme, especially on the ag finance part of those articles.
So it's an interesting illustration of the trends in farm management research in the country. One thing that you would like to see happen, you say, Terry, is that producers continue, in whatever means would be feasible, to supply you and your peers with ideas on what they'd like to know regarding farm management.
Sure.
If you want to boil it down even further, precision agricultural economics, your field. So whatever avenues exist, you'd like producers to pursue that.
Sure. A lot of my greatest ideas weren't my ideas at all. I mean, they came from, actual practitioners of, farming sciences, farmers and consultants. And so I am constantly observing and watching and keeping an eye out. So it could be as simple as noticing something on social media, Twitter, but a really good way of farmers interacting with us, maybe at an event like CARTA, January 16, 17, 2020.
Kansas Agriculture Research and Technology Association.
It's all about ag tech. It's all grassroots. It's farmer-led. There will be a handful of us from each of the departments here in the College of Ag who will be there on site delivering presentations. 150 people will be in a room, but that's a really good place for exchange of ideas. It's a two-way conversation. I don't just talk, I also listen.
Excellent. By the way, that's coming right up, as Terry says, January the 16th and the 17th in Junction City, the convention center there. You can find out more about that at cartaonline.org. But as for this exercise, it's rather unusual in its approach, and it's rendering some pretty interesting findings, Terry.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed doing this, and I put up a blog on my personal website with some highlights, and the final article will be online with the 2020 issue of the journal. And I would like to remind our listeners that, this is one of the few academic journals that, you're not going to run into a paywall. And so you can go to the journal website. The articles are in PDF. They're freely accessible. And they're not written to an academic audience. They're written for the membership of the society, which are practicing farm managers and practicing rural appraisers and agricultural consultants. So
they're practical articles, aren't they not?
They're practical articles and understandable, which these should be.
Again, that is the Journal of the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers, from which Terry drew the data over several years' time on farm management articles that have appeared in that journal and how those are trending over time. Terry, thanks for this unique look. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be here.
He's Terry Griffin, precision agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are tuned to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Once more, in our 95th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains. Eric Atkinson here. Today's agricultural news headlines coming your way now, courtesy in part of DTN. With the Sunday deadline looming, President Trump has reportedly agreed to delay a new round of 15% tariffs on $160 billion in Chinese consumer exports to the U.S. By late afternoon yesterday, multiple news media were reporting that the president had agreed to terms on the limited Phase 1 deal. Yet the White House had not released any statements or details and haven't as of this moment. Chinese officials in recent weeks have repeatedly called on the U.S. to remove existing tariffs ranging from 10 to 25% on as much as $360 billion in Chinese exports as the two sides moved toward a limited deal that would include boosting U.S. agricultural exports. Now, Chinese officials just last week agreed to temporarily allow private companies to import U.S. pork and soybeans without retaliatory tariffs placed on those. The Wall Street Journal reporting yesterday the latest U.S. offer involved canceling the new round of tariffs and cutting the current tariffs in half on Chinese goods as a way to advance the first phase of the deal. Speaking to reporters yesterday while in Omaha, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue said he was not updated on the latest information, but he was encouraged by the news he was hearing coming out of Washington. Speaking to attendees at the Farmers Business Network conference, Perdue said it would be, in his words, a real bonanza if China were to follow through and buy $40 to $50 billion in agricultural products from the U.S. That would be roughly double what China bought from the U.S. at its peak. While such agricultural sales, said the Secretary, would be positive for the industry, he said any deal with China has to be enforceable and has to be achievable, as he put it. And that's what Ambassador Lighthizer and President Trump are insisting upon, in his words. Looking at trade aid, Perdue said the next tranche of market facilitation program payments could go out in early January, but first must be approved by the White House Office of Management and Budget. Here's more on that from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue has the latest on this year's market facilitation program, which is aimed at mitigating agricultural losses from trade.
The question has to do with the third tranche of MFP payments for this year. And I am expecting that. We haven't seen anything to give us any indication that way.
Speaking to reporters in Nebraska, he said USDA authorizes the money, but the Office of Management and the Budget makes the allocation.
They were very helpful in the second tranche that we got out before Thanksgiving, and we don't see a market move that would make it not needed for the third tranche after the first of the year.
On whether there will be another market facilitation program for 2020, he made no commitments.
If we can get a deal with China, if markets move, if we can accumulate these trading relationships that we have, and we get back to a more stable trade relationship, I'd be hopeful that we wouldn't need a third market facilitation program.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
At that same media session, the Secretary said that line by line, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement is an improvement over the North American Free Trade Agreement. Even though producers were among the groups most loyal to the benefits of NAFTA, USMCA addresses some technology issues that did not exist in the early 1990s, says the Secretary. That trade deal is now expected to go to the House floor next week for a vote after the House votes on articles of impeachment. Still, Perdue said he was pleased House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is moving ahead on a USMCA vote. He also highlighted the bilateral agreement with Japan that lowered or eliminated tariffs on 90% of agricultural goods going into Japan, putting the U.S., he says, on an even playing field with other Japanese trading partners. Coming your way now, this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop with Marcia Boswell. Marcia?
Great Plains Analytical Laboratory, Cereal Ingredients, Inc., and their CEO, Robert Hatch, have provided a significant donation to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation in support of impactful wheat research. The gift will be directed toward ongoing research aimed at developing wheat varieties that result in high-quality baked goods. Hatch is chairman and CEO of Cereal Ingredients, Inc., a specialty food ingredients manufacturer he founded in 1990, and CEO of Great Plains Analytical Laboratory, an analytical laboratory founded as a response to a need in the grain, flour, baking, and food industries for a high level of service response time and expertise. The Kansas Wheat Commission prides itself in directing farmer checkoff dollars to research that results in high-yielding and high-quality wheat varieties. For more than 50 years, the Kansas Wheat Commission has provided funding for K-State wheat breeders. For 8 of the past 10 years, that dollar amount has exceeded $1.1 million. The Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation differs from the Wheat Checkoff. While the checkoff does fund wheat research, it is also used for marketing, promotion, and education. Donations to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation will be used only for wheat research. Through its Fields Forward fundraising campaign, the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation is raising funds furthering wheat research efforts led by K-State faculty that increase the profitability of farmers while improving the quality of wheat for millers, bakers, and consumers. Recent technological breakthroughs in wheat genetics research will allow us to accelerate delivery of high-value traits to market. In 2017, the reference map of the bread wheat genome was completed by a consortium of international scientists. This new map, in conjunction with emerging technologies like gene editing, will assist in identification and integrations of high-quality end-use traits into new wheat varieties. This gift will be used to help support this research. According to Aaron Harries, the Vice President of Research and Operations for the Kansas Wheat Commission, the team conducting this research includes some of the brightest scientists in the wheat research community. Depending on the discoveries made, this project has the potential to revolutionize the way farmers grow wheat for added value. Ron Supis, chair of the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation, said, "We greatly appreciate this support of the wheat and baking industries by Great Plains Analytical Laboratories, Cereal Ingredients, and Robert Hatch. This wheat research is aimed at developing wheat varieties that result in high-quality baked goods." For more information, visit fieldsforward.org. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
All right, Marcia, many thanks. Could be a snowy start to this coming week. Mary Knapp will tell us more next on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Agriculture Today is back now, as is climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. It's time once more to glance at Kansas agricultural weather. Easily described this past week. It was dry throughout virtually all of Kansas, Mary.
Yes, it was dry and it was warm. On the dry side, the moisture that was recorded in the state was kind of in an unusual area. West Central actually came out as the wettest division in the state.
How many times does that happen?
Right. Not very often, especially in the wintertime where they're typically drier. But it wasn't by any means enormous amounts. The division averaged 0.03 of an inch, which is 23% of normal. Not division-wide by any means. The Northwest Division also saw a little bit. There was kind of a surprise snowstorm in that extreme northern area around Atwood. They averaged 100th of an inch of precip, which, again, is not much. It comes to about 8% of their normal. There was also a little bit of a storm in north central, in the Scandia area, but that was small enough it didn't even tilt the divisional average to above zero. And all the rest of the divisions averaged zero. And the statewide average for the week, again, also zero. Not unheard of at this time of the year, but certainly not anything to improve the drought conditions that are affecting the western two-thirds of the state, really.
And clearly, then, the drought conditions have intensified in the state and have expanded, you say, according to the latest monitor.
Right. And again, that's coupled with the warmer temperatures. The statewide average was about 5 degrees warmer than normal for the week. Mm-hmm. So the lack of moisture coupled with the warmer conditions drove the drought monitor to intensify or further degradation. Basically, the week before, we had a little over half of the state that was drought-free. This week, we're down to 45% of the state drought-free, and that, again, is concentrated in the eastern third of the state. We had expansion of abnormally dry conditions in the central part of the state and expansions of the moderate drought and severe drought in south central, not quite encompassing the entire division, but creeping closer to that Arkansas River line.
So, again, 55% of the state now at some level of drought. In some places it's really tough out there. Looking for the next moisture opportunity, which will come, you say, the latter part of the weekend into next week, and it will be of the wintry kind.
Right. At this point, they're looking for a snow event coming through starting Sunday and going in through Monday. The chances are fairly good, pretty much statewide, for some sort of moisture for that. When we look at the quantitative precip forecast, which again looks at how much water might be squeezed out of the system, we're looking at a band of between 1/4 and 1/2 an inch across most of the central part of the state. The amounts drop off a little bit as you go north and south of that center corridor, but still they're looking at 1/10 of an inch or more, and that is a fairly substantial amount for this time of the year where we don't typically see a lot of moisture. It would be welcome, but it is not likely to do much more than stall the drought expansion rather than actually result in any kind of improvement. We need repeated events like that for the rest of the year to make any kind of substantial improvement on the drought conditions.
Now, for travelers, will this be mostly snow? Will we have that dreaded wintry mix anywhere in this system?
In the western part of the state, they're looking at mostly snow. That always gets complicated by wind, and there will likely be wind with the event as well. So maybe more of the visibility issues. In the eastern part of the state, that wintry mix is part of that. And as we all well know, it doesn't take much of that to create quite a bit of travel hazards. Elevated surfaces will freeze first, and what can be really difficult is if you have that slick layer that's covered by a little bit of snow. And again, just be cautious and watch for changing conditions on the road surface. And again, check in with the Weather Service and the KDOT for updates on the conditions as this storm develops further.
All right, heads up on that. And once that system moves out, then what's in the outlook for the remainder of next week?
Well, if we look at the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks, they are both calling for drier and warmer than normal. So this is expected to be a fairly fast-moving. Keep in mind, warmer than normal doesn't necessarily mean warm. Our normals now are edging towards highs in the lower 40s and lows in the 20s, so it could still be on the cold side. Also of note is people are already interested in what's going to happen for the holiday season.
From the traveling perspective.
From traveling perspective, from activity perspective, basically at this point, what we look for is the experimental 3 to 4 week outlook, which would carry us from Christmas to New Year's. That pattern is actually favoring wetter than normal conditions. So we'll be tuned to that as we get closer to that season.
And next Friday we'll talk in more particulars about the Christmas weather ahead. And one last thing here, we've been harping on it, but with good reason. The rangeland fire danger index remains at a high level throughout the better part of the state because of the fuel load and the continued dryness.
Right. When you get these frontal systems passing through with very strong winds, that means a fire can behave in a much more aggressive manner than might be expected. So, again, it behooves anyone that's doing outdoor activities to be cautious about any kind of a spark or a flame that might set things off. We haven't had a whole lot of red flag warnings. There was one issued yesterday for the southeast area because of the winds and the low humidity. But again, when these frontal systems come through, they generally bring some pretty aggressive winds along with them, and that, again, complicates any kind of fire management.
Take care out there is the recurring message. Enjoy your weekend, Mary. Thank you for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
On Kansas agricultural weather, climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. And thanks to you for tuning in. Enjoy your weekend as well. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.